Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I live, work and write on Gadigal land, and I pay my sincere respects to Gadigal and all elders, past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who might be with us this evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Rachel Franks. I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and it is my pleasure this evening to introduce you to a new session of History Matters. Tonight we'll be discussing community archives with some wonderful speakers. If you have any questions for our speakers, please ask them through the chat feature on Zoom, and we'll get to those questions after the presentations. It is also a pleasure this evening to introduce your chair, Lisa Murray. Lisa is currently the President of the Professional Historians Association, New South Wales and ACT, which with their colleagues in Oral History New South Wales are the curators and project organisers for this amazing series, which is now in its second year. Lisa Murray is, of course, well known as the City of Sydney historian. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's great to be here. I would like to acknowledge that I live, work and write on the land of the Wongal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are delighted to present you another History Matters session. This series explores issues that stimulate and bedevil the work of public historians. And tonight we're going to be exploring community archives. Community archives are, of course, gathered by many history and heritage groups, and frequently these collections document social and community histories that are marginalised or excluded from major cultural collections. So these collections often evolve, sometimes without much thought to collecting criteria, and it's often a challenge for groups to work with their community archives and make them accessible. So what are the challenges and responsibilities of historians working with community archives? We have two fantastic speakers for you this evening. I will introduce each of them and then in turn. First up, we have Scott McKinnon. He is a historian at the University of Wollongong. He is the Vice President of both Pride History Group and Oral History New South Wales. Scott is the author of several books and articles. He is the co-editor with Margaret Cook of Disasters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophe, which is coming out later this year with Palgrave MacMillan. So look out for that one. He is also the author of Gay Men at the Movies, Cinema, Memory and the History of a Gay Male Community. That was published in 2016. Tonight, Scott will be sharing his experience working with the Pride History Group and their oral history collections. Please welcome and enjoy Scott McKinnon.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you to the State Library and the Professional Historians Association and my buddies at Oral History New South Wales for organising these great events. I'm coming to you from my home in Thirroul, so I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Darawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge that most of the work of Pride History Group happens on Gadigal land. And pay my respects to elders there as well. So Pride History Group it was founded in the early 2000s. It's a volunteer-run community history group. It has the focus of recording, preserving, writing about the history of Sydney's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer communities. The group was founded by a group of lesbian and gay activists who had each been very active in lesbian and gay rights and liberation politics through the 70s and 80s, and who were concerned by the early 2000s that much of the history of both the social life and the activist movement of LGBTQ Sydney was being forgotten or didn't have a place where it was appropriately being preserved and recorded. And I think there was a feeling as well that the recording of that history needed to come from within the community itself. And in part, that's simply because it wasn't happening elsewhere, or not to the extent that was necessary. So I think it's reasonable to say that LGBTQ activism is one of the great social movements of Australian history. It's really seen a social group move from criminalisation and violent oppression towards increasing acceptance and tolerance, even if that is unevenly experienced and often fairly precarious. But the history of the movement, it's not taught in schools, certainly to any great extent. If you don't study that history at university, and most of us don't, then where are the resources for LGBTQ people? And where is the history of that movement being preserved? I think it's also true that many of our major collecting institutions have a fairly complicated history themselves in terms of their support for LGBT communities. And happily, that has changed enormously over time. But of course, I think now one of the problems that we're facing is that those institutions are overworked and underfunded. So perhaps an organisation like Pride History Group is moving from a point of arguing with collecting institutions to take this history more seriously, towards instead providing a kind of support for organisations or bigger collecting institutions, that we can work together to do the kind of work that in a better world they might be better funded to do. So there's definitely an activist purpose to the history that we're doing. The activist movement through the 70s and 80s was very much about creating visibility for LGBT communities, and that was incredibly successful. But now I think it's about making sure that the history of that new movement and that community maintains that visibility, that there's a place for it to be seen and talked about and added to bigger conversations. So what does Pride History Group do? We're a digital rather than a physical archive, and our main purpose in terms of collecting is oral history. There's a few reasons that we don't have a significant physical collection. One is simply that we don't have the physical space to develop a physical collection. We have an office in Glebe, which is provided to us through the City of Sydney's Creative and Cultural Spaces program. And I want to give a quick shout out to the City of Sydney, who have been incredibly supportive of Pride History Group and the work that we've done ever since we were founded. So we don't have the space to house a physical archive, nor do we have the capacity in terms of volunteer hours to develop and properly care for a physical collection. And I think probably most importantly is that there's also in Melbourne, the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, and they were established in the late 1970s, and they have a pretty amazing physical collection of the same kind of history that we're working with. Again, that's an organisation that's run by volunteers, a particularly hardworking and dedicated group working down in Melbourne. So generally, if we're approached by people wanting to make a donation of a physical item, then we will either direct them to ALGA or in some cases to the State Library of New South Wales. At the moment, a former president of Pride History Group, Robert French, is a professional archivist. He is working to prepare the papers of Lex Watson for donation to the State Library. And Lex was a leading figure in gay rights and HIV/AIDS activism. And his papers give an incredibly valuable insight into that history and into the life of a particularly interesting man. And so we'll work with Robert is working with the State Library to prepare those items. So our collection is mostly oral history. We've got about 100 interviews with people who've played, over 100 now actually, interviews with people who've played some role in the history of Sydney's LGBTQ past. Those interviews stretch back to memories of social life in the 1930s, into the emergence of a more open gay and lesbian social scene in the 1960s, the emergence of activism in the 70s, and some interviews around the HIV/AIDS crisis as well. And those interviews take a life narrative approach. So we get a fuller picture of people's lives as well as the particular events along the way. I want to quickly acknowledge that the vast majority of those interviews have been done by one person. John Liddy was one of the founders of Pride History Group. He's not a professional historian or an academic historian, but his dedication to recording those interviews and to making sure that history is preserved has been pretty amazing. So the fact that we have this incredible archive is largely due to him. And I think that speaks to the importance within these kind of community organizations of the particularly hard work of individuals along the way. So we have this fantastic collection, but as an oral historian myself, I always have this fear that we might spend a huge amount of time recording great interviews, but then what happens to them after that? And do they sit on a shelf or a computer or in the cloud somewhere without being listened to? So beyond recording those interviews, we try to spend a lot of time ensuring that they are accessible and used in valuable ways. The collection, we've provided access to full interviews to researchers doing work on the history of LGBTIQ Sydney, includes academic historians like myself. I've used the collection quite a bit, postgraduate students, and we used to do that by providing access in our office in Glebe. And that isn't always easy. It means organising times for one of our volunteers to meet the researcher and sit with them in the space as they do their research. And it's also a little bit complicated in that we haven't had a great way for people to search what's actually available in the collection. So it's often involved people, one of the volunteers doing research on behalf of the researcher to identify which interviews are going to be valuable to them. Nowadays, we're more likely to first do that research and then share with researchers via Dropbox or some form of cloud storage an interview, as long as we have the permission of the interviewee to do that. The interviews have also been used outside academia. They were used by filmmakers making a TV movie for the ABC called Riot about the first Mardi Gras. So that film, we were able to work with the researchers who are writing that film on the history of the event. And we were also able to share with the actors who were playing real life figures, interviews with the people they were portraying so that they could get the voice of the people that they were portraying on screen. And I've done a bit of work in creating audio documentaries. I've made a couple of episodes of a podcast series that I had very ambitious plans of creating this fantastic ongoing podcast series. Unfortunately, I have this frustrating need to have an actual job that pays actual money. So that has always gets put back on the back burner, but I still have these plans to do that. I've worked with Catherine Franey, who's a brilliant radio producer and historian, on a 2-part documentary series for the ABC Radio National History Listen program, and that used archived interviews as well. So I think in coming back to that purpose of ensuring that LGBTQ history is better understood and that there are resources around to make up maybe for the lack of teaching in schools and other places, we have, I think, an important responsibility as a community archive, not just to collect, but to ensure that our collection is broadly accessible as much as we can within the limitations of of a volunteer group, and that it's used in interesting ways to create valuable resources. And to that end, some of our committee members and some of our committee and other members of our group have been really working very hard over the last couple of years to create a new website for the group. And a shout out to Sarah Midgley, who's one of the committee members who's worked incredibly hard on this. That's still in development, but I thought I'd just talk about that website for a little while, a couple of minutes or a minute or so, just to get a sense of how we use that as a kind of a digital archive. So I think we have 2 audiences for that. We have researchers who want access to good primary source material for their work in LGBTQ history. So we're trying to put full interviews up online. That's a very complicated process, in part because we want to make sure we have the consent of all interviewees before we do put those up online, as well as just the logistics of doing that. And I think our second audience is people, community members who just want some quick access to some interesting elements of our history. They're not going to listen to a full interview. So we create audio excerpts and develop them into themes, and we put them up onto the website as well. So we've got these different audiences in mind that we want to cater for. We do a lot more work on a lot more projects. I'm running out of time to talk through those clearly, but I just wanted to take a minute or two to talk about some of the challenges that we have. And one of those is around ensuring inclusion and diversity within the archive. As it stands, the archive we have is very much focused on gay and lesbian histories, and we have a lot of work to do in making sure that we broaden that to include bisexual, transgender, gender, non-binary people as well, and their history. And another challenge is simply around time for a volunteer group with busy lives and busy jobs, making sure that we have the time and the capacity in terms of volunteers to do the work to keep going with the work that we want to do. And there's always a question, I think, hanging over a group like this is if the volunteers aren't there, if the volunteers don't keep doing that work, what we do with the collection then and how we continue to make it accessible. So to that end, I'll just end by saying we're always looking for volunteers. We have a great team and I'm really grateful for the work that they do, but have a look at our website, which is pridehistory.org.au. A lot of resources on there, and get in touch. And I'll hand back over to Lisa there.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was a really great presentation, and it's always interesting to hear how different groups view their material and work together. And I'm glad you put a call out for volunteers. Always good never to miss an opportunity. I would now like to invite our second speaker to join us. Christine Yeats is the president of the Royal Australian Historical Society, but that's not all. She is also the National President of the Independent Scholars Association of Australia and the immediate past chair of the Independent Scholars in New South Wales, as well as being the convener of the Assessment Subcommittee of the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. In other words, she's a very busy woman. Christine is an archivist, a researcher, and a historian, and she's a member of the Professional Historians Association. Many of you would know Christine from her time as an archivist at the New South Wales State Archives. She has been involved in history and archives both at a community and government level. And so we are very lucky to learn from her experience tonight on the subject of community archives. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight to the group. That's fantastic. And I will also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. When I started to consider the question of local and community history groups, I realised that the challenges that I'm going to talk about are shared by both historians and archivists. And I guess it's no surprise, given my line of work, that I also include archivists. And I realised that the overarching challenge facing historians and facing archivists in managing community archives collections is in sustainability. And to a lesser extent, and not always, it doesn't always apply, but also in ensuring the relevance and the community understanding of the relevance of the collection, I should say. So when we talk about community archives, what are we actually talking about? And they are a mix, created or accumulated, described and preserved by individuals and community groups who desire to document their cultural heritage based on shared experiences, interests and identities. Now, they are often embarked upon by people who don't have formal training as archivists or historians, or indeed librarians. And they often embark on the exercise without traditional, within archival circles, collection policies and governance guidelines. And sometimes it is generated by a significant shared event, a decision to collect material because it relates to something that happened that's really important. And of course, COVID-19 is the example that immediately comes to mind, although of course, if we had watched Australian Story, would be reminded that 100 years ago, we faced the influenza pandemic. Above all, community archives are created by a response to needs defined by the members of the community. And those members exert a control over how the materials are used. And this, of course, is another challenge faced by historians who may wish to use material, and there are conditions and provisos that either inhibit or maybe make it more difficult. Now, there are numerous examples of community archives right across Australia. School archives, an obvious one. Local libraries have local studies collections, and of course historical societies. They all keep archives, as does the Royal Australian Historical Society. Local studies collections are often the most extraordinary mix because they can include local council records, the formal records that we all find, those snippets of information about the locality that just can't be found anywhere else. We also find photographs, pictorial material, and also privately donated material. And sometimes even, these days we tend to assume that everything's on Trove, all newspapers on Trove. But in fact, sometimes local studies collections have clippings from newspapers which have no longer existed, and that's the only copy. Oftentimes, local studies collections are managed by archivists and librarians, certainly, and sometimes the archivist or librarian are also historians, and they often write up the material. And there are a couple of notable examples I know within the PHA membership. School archives are an interesting example because they are often prompted by alumni, people who want to celebrate the history of the school for whatever reason, and because they feel very close to it. And school archives collections often range from the obvious ones of school rolls, documentary material, I should say, but also things like honour balls, school uniforms, and a mix of other trophies, all of which create challenges and problems for their proper care. But both local government and school archives are linked by home, by the fact that is the linkage. They are linked to a locality, or they are linked to a particular school and the history of that school. And quite often, the initiative to develop the archive is undertaken, but often with the case of schools, without really referring to the local community. Less so, of course, with local studies collections, which are often prompted by the local community that want some material kept. And for those local studies collections and for these school archives, they're very fortunate if they have a historian on staff. But quite often the historian is a client. They come in to use the records either for their own research purposes or because they are commissioned to do some work for the organisation. And that's a challenge because quite often they come in to do the work where advice might have been quite useful in terms of setting up the collection that makes it more usable. Historical societies also collect local government records. Sometimes they collect them because there's been a council amalgamation, and in my time when I was an archivist at the State Archives, we often heard about local government collections being dumped at the tip and the local historical society going and getting them and rescuing them. Thankfully, I don't think that happens so much anymore. But local historical societies collect a miscellany of material, mostly private material. Now, historical societies depend largely on the kindness of local government often to provide a venue, often at no rent or not a minimal rent. They often operate without really firm collection strategies. They often operate because they love history, they love doing what they do. And they prepare displays, they often do publications, do exhibitions. They often have really good publications, local histories, and they have websites, social media, etc. They welcome new members to assist in arranging the collection, looking after the collection. And in most cases, the members of local history societies see themselves as historians, perhaps not with a capital H, and sometimes even as archivists. And sometimes that's true. But they are the custodians of local memories, and they are often the sole custodian of those. And they do an extraordinary job in seeking to preserve the records of the local community. Oftentimes that they're the only ones doing it. And I would say almost universally that they welcome professional historians, those who are not from the region but who are coming in to do research using the collection, because that validates the collection, and they think that's fantastic. And I must admit, when as a member of a local historical society and as a former president of my local historical society, I was always delighted to hear stories of how we'd help someone, particularly academics, because they get to understand the value of those local collections, the wealth of material sitting inside storage cabinets, arranged and described, just waiting to be accessed. But how do we get more historians to use that material and to validate the collection in many ways? Local historical societies are challenged by an ageing demographic. You probably hear that all the time about lots of different organisations. And increasingly, the members who they may have once drawn upon have many conflicting demands on their time. And we have really entered the world of the time poor. So can community archives involve historians? Absolutely. We just heard from Scott exactly how they can. They benefit from in a variety of different ways. And I'll come to that in a minute. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that I've just highlighted local government archives and school archives, but there are many other types of local collections created by community groups, community organisations, and they often they are preserving a memory, they have a relevance, a very particular relevance. We heard about the Pride History Group. Increasingly now, there are a number of First Nations, Aboriginal keeping places and cultural centres. They too draw on those from their own community, Aboriginal people who are historians and or archivists. And the active involvement of those communities is needed. And again, Scott has highlighted that. You can collect material, you can get it all set up, but it needs to be sustained over time. We need to keep on adding to it, keep on making sure that it's up to date and making sure that it's relevant. And that is the ongoing demand and ongoing challenge for historians and archivists. Now, the other challenge, and this is a big one in local archives, historical society archives and local studies collections too, to an extent, is that the materials they often collect aren't what traditional archivists might consider to be archives. They can be described as the humdrum records of daily activity, and they can be objects and digital. And sometimes they're collected holus bolus, a really technical term there, without really understanding. They think that something's nice, we must collect it. And it is the contextualisation of local history materials, many of them objects with local significance, that can be enhanced with reference to the wider social or economic developments. That often is lost in local displays. They will put the object nicely on display, but they don't always draw in the big picture. And the insight provided by historians can really breathe life into museum objects and give them a relevance that might otherwise be missing. Now, I'm not sure how I'm going for time, but I'll just wind up because I just wanted to say too that in terms of planning a collection and even in terms of the ongoing management, historians can provide advice. They can also support, and they can sometimes assist in finding volunteers and also sometimes assist in finding money that might support the collection, sometimes alerting the custodians of local collections to grant programs and other ways of finding money. So there's lots of other ways, and which I'll be happy to deal with if it comes up in question time. But again, I think the example of COVID-19 is one that is an opportunity that we need to, as historians and as archivists, need to deal with, because there will be a plethora of material in many formats. There'll be a lot of oral history material, of course, because that's what it's largely going to be, photographs, documents. And I think therein lies, again, an example of a challenge for the future for historians and archivists, ensuring that these records are captured, preserved, and remain sustainable for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. It was really great to hear your perspective and from all your experience. And I think there's so much there we can go on. So we're now moving on to questions. So Scott's joining us again and Rachel's going to be assisting us. Do you have some instructions for people, Rachel, to get us involved?
People have been sending through some questions through the chat feature, which is working really well. And also lots of people just writing in to say thank you both very much to Scott and to Christine for such wonderful presentations. So lovely always to pass on that great feedback. We do have a very specific question for Scott. So someone with us tonight is working with a collection of volunteers to set up a digital archive of Indonesian queer content. So far they've got a large number of objects ranging from 1968 to 2010. So the beginnings of quite a substantial collection there. They're wondering if you have any advice for a fledgling digital community archive project that you can share.
Wow. Well,
it's a small question.
It's a small question, yeah. First of all, I guess, great that you're doing that work and starting the collection. I think one of the things to think about at the beginning of the collection is very carefully what you want to do as an organisation and the kind of history that you want to preserve, and thinking about that in the context of what capacity you will have to be able to carefully look after whatever the items that you're collecting in your archive, and how you're going to make them accessible to the communities that you are hoping will engage with them. So it takes a lot, I think, at the beginning. I wasn't there at the beginning of Pride History Group, but I think it takes a lot at the beginning of the organisation to think through so some of those details, even writing a kind of a strategy for your organisation, because questions will come up along the way around, you know, is this particular item something that we were intending to collect in our collection? You might want to prioritise items that aren't going to be held elsewhere if you have limited resources and limited space. Yeah, I guess thinking through those details, and maybe just to pass off the question onto someone else, I'd also recommend getting in touch with the people at the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, who will, I think, be more helpful in terms of that kind of physical collection. But yeah, I guess that's my strategy from the beginning, is to really carefully plan through what it is you want to do right from the start, so that you have that set in place as questions come along in time.
That's great advice. And another request for advice from Christine. So somebody's asking you, Christine, what would you tell professional historians who are often greeted with suspicion when they offer to help manage local history societies and their collections?
Well, it's always a question of building up trust, and often the best approach is not to go in saying, I know everything. It's often the best approach is to take a consultative way of dealing and try and by examples of where, using examples of other work that's been done, particularly if they're professional historians, of other work they have done using the archives. And it is often, particularly for historical societies that have been doing the same thing for many, many years, it is a question, it's the old-fashioned thing of, you know, being polite but also offering sensible advice and not talking down. I think that's probably the best way in the end, is being helpful, but don't pretend that you know everything, because that never tends to work. But I think drawing on certainly published examples and drawing on material and advice that local groups can follow and dip into.
And another question for Scott. So specifically about the oral testimonies that you were talking about in your presentation. So the question is around transcription. Will you be putting full transcripts on the website, or more will you be looking at keywords and synopses? So there's an acknowledgement in this question that time and money is limited, and how might you balance that with making these rich histories accessible?
That's a great question, and is something that we've had to make decisions around. So we don't have transcripts, full transcripts of the interviews in the collection. We do timed summaries instead, and keywords. So that makes it accessible while reducing the number of hours that are required to put the work in. Even just creating a time summary of an interview takes a long time. So that's the strategy that we've used, and we'll make those time summaries available on the website as well, although there are new and interesting technologies coming up all the time around sort of automatic transcription and searchable technologies for putting oral history transcripts, oral history recordings online. The State Library has done really interesting work around that. So through their Amplify technology. So there are these new ideas that are coming up all the time, but our strategy to date has just been around using time summaries because of that issue that the questioner has identified about time.
And back to Christine. So someone in the audience is suggesting that they completely agree with you regarding the value of the local studies collections. But again, talking about accessibility, how do we make these often quite niche or special collections more accessible by letting people know what's actually in them?
Well, I see that in some ways as a challenge for the Royal Australian Historical Society, if it's an affiliated society, that leading and encouraging others to follow the lead of those who have been successful in encouraging people, historians, local community coming in to use the collection. Where there are genuine issues, and that's often the case with collections which might contain sensitive material, there does need there to be a system of working out what the access regime is. And in terms of, and Scott covered this just briefly in talking about gathering in collections, it's always important at the outset to identify what the access regime is, because quite often with certain categories of material, the donor has said, look, we don't want people going through the records for 30 years or however many years. Again, it comes back to explaining how the records are going to be used. And sometimes too, they've had a bad experience. Someone has come in, used the records, and often never even acknowledged the role of the community archive in any way, and basically just used them up and just moved on. And that, of course, creates very bad feeling, as it would with any you know, even when I was working in the State Archives, when people came in and used material and everyone was super, super helpful, and not even an acknowledgement in the book. So it's things like that. It's building up trust. And most historical societies, within reason, unless there's some issue about actual access to the building, are usually happy to have people use the collection. But it is more of an issue where it's a specialist collection. Some school archives are very particular about who uses the collection. They, because of, I don't know why, but they are. But again, it's putting forward a case, putting forward an argument, and sometimes too leading, as I said, alerting custodians to what other groups have done, and so almost like getting a reference that you have used the records from this organisation. And sometimes, in fact, that might be helpful to get a letter of introduction from a group where you have used the records and where they have felt that it's been a question of trust and working together. The main challenge in terms of, I have to say, in terms of local studies areas, local historical collections, more than local studies areas, is in actually getting people to come in. But one bad experience can certainly sour the whole arrangement. So we try to, you know, encourage people to, you know, as we all do, to follow, you know, the usual protocols when you're accessing records. I hope that helps.
And this is a question for both Christine and Scott, and it's about, again, talking about access for these quite special collections that people might be only vaguely aware of or not really appreciate the detail of what it is that's being held. And they're asking if forums such as Victoria Collections might be an opportunity to sort of highlight that there is a collection and it's in this place and it's available in this way, and just generally how you might cross-promote some of these collections.
Scott, do you want to go first?
I'll leave it to you, Christine.
Okay. Well, I would say in terms of promoting, there's a good opportunity through the Royal Australian Historical Society. We don't have a register of local historical societies that have records, because they don't all have records. Many of them are simply a group of interested people and they don't do any collecting. But there is always the potential through our e-news and other publications to promote a collection. And also simply they can do it themselves through social media. And the really active local groups, I notice when I go to their and have a look at their websites, they will have a list of all their publications. They'll have a list of the details of when they're open, and they'll do simple research, often for a small fee, but they'll do simple research. So there's all of those sorts of ways. Part of the challenge, I think, for historians is to encourage local collecting archives, whether they're at a community level or otherwise, to be more outward looking. I think that is a genuine challenge, because quite often the people who love collecting things do love collecting them, and they're good at collecting, but they don't necessarily look outside to who might use them. And they'll often think, I'll put them neatly on the shelf, and then they'll sit there and no one will make them untidy. So it is, I suppose that's a challenge for the Royal Australian Historical Society and other peak bodies to encourage groups through, just through e-news, but also through grants. Because one of the things that the RAHS does is administer grants. We don't have the money to, we administer them on behalf of the government. They're not our money, it isn't our money. And making it a condition. This is one of the things, if you do this, then you have to publish, then you have to let people know that you've done it. And that creates that level of communication. And I know, I can understand the question being asked, I've gone around the world a bit there, but it is, again, it's about through its encouragement, and also even, and I'll see this as a challenge to myself, to promote how we talk about the collections that we've used and what fantastic things we found there.
I guess just building on that, I think we those different audiences that I was talking about in my presentation. So we want to make sure that postgrad students doing work in this field know about our work. So we will do work through the Royal Australian Historical Society or History Council New South Wales or the Australian Centre for Public History at UTS, and we've done work with City of Sydney as well, with Lisa and the team there. So making sure that people researching history are aware of the archive and know what we're up to. But we'll also go to events during the Mardi Gras festival. We have a stall at the Fair Day during Mardi Gras. So we're doing events, public events during Pride Festival. We try to engage the community more broadly as well. So trying to engage not just the kind of professional or academic historian side of things, but also community members as well.
And I think Scott, that really brings up the point that Christine brought out in her talk around relevance. And I think that the Pride History Group is a really great example of the way that, as a history group, you're thinking about your different audiences and you're making sure you're getting out there and showing how your collection is relevant to them. And then they're more likely to engage with that collection and sort of value it, and then hopefully become volunteers and get more involved. So I think it's that lovely sort of circular thing, isn't it? You've got to show that community relevance and respect and build up those communications to really draw people in.
Absolutely, and communicating in the history in a way that's immediately interesting and engaging to people, whether they've got sort of 5 minutes to spare or they're doing a PhD. Like there's different ways that you can work with the material in the collection to engage those audiences in different ways.
Yeah. Question that's gone from access to acquisition, and this can often be a really complicated area to go into. So say you've got a relationship with somebody and you do have some of that trust there, and it's about how you might value the importance of what someone would like to donate. Often things are particularly, you've both mentioned objects tonight, and some of them are more difficult to store than others. So how do you negotiate the idea of, as Christine mentioned, the humdrum record or thing, and how do you look at what is very specifically of local interest, and so you might want to collect it anyway, and what is of a broader historical interest?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and difficult question that I'm sure every organisation and archive struggles with at times. For us, we are approached sometimes with people who have an object or a room full of papers or something like that, that they want to place somewhere. And because we don't collect that physical archive, we'll direct their queries elsewhere. Sometimes that really hurts because it's something that's really fantastic and we'd just like it for ourselves. But there's assessments that every collecting organisation is going to have to make. And sometimes that might be a bit difficult for the person who wants to make the donation because they're thinking that they have something that's really valuable and it is really valuable to them, but a collecting organisation might already have a couple of copies of that particular item. So there's decisions that are being made within the organisation about their capacity to hold it, their capacity to look after it, and to make it accessible. That can be, always tough. And so that goes back, I think, to that question about the start of a new archive, about making those decisions about what is it that you want to do with this. But yeah, I'm sure Christine has more to add on that.
The hardest thing is how to say no, and that can be that's one of the greatest challenges, because if it's always good, and this is when I was involved with heavily involved with my local historical society, to develop a collection policy that you can say, this is a collection policy. It gives you then the justification for saying no. We always, with the local group, we always tried to accommodate, but sometimes you have to say no. And particularly with books, actually, that's the interesting, I'm just looking at Lisa's, all the books behind Lisa, that people have lovely collections, you know, they've developed them over years, and they want to donate them to the local historical society, to the RAHS. And we have to say to them, look, they're lovely, and if we don't have them, we'll keep them, and that's wonderful, but we will probably sell them if we don't need them, if they're duplicates. And, you know, it is really hard. So that's why having collection policies, having policy on donations that allows you in the document to say, yes, we'll take it, we might take it for now, but it's in our gift, if you like, that we may dispose of it to down the track, or we might return it to your family. And the other important thing about having a donor document is that someone comes along and says, oh, why have you got this? It belonged to grandma. And, you know, I always said to historical societies, you have the document that proves why you have it, and that justifies. So but the hardest thing is saying no, actually.
And a question now quite specifically for you, Scott. Is the Pride Archive being developed through interviews with activists today, or is your work predominantly around the existing archive?
To date, the archive has been mainly about activists in the 70s and 80s, but it is ongoing. The work never ends, and it would be great, I think, to expand that, to keep developing that. Yeah, so the existing archive as it stands, I guess, is very much focused on that particular point in time, but we definitely have intentions and ambitions to expand beyond that.
Always room for one more history.
Isn't there though? Yeah.
That's the end of our questions. We're having heaps and heaps of comments coming through saying how much they've enjoyed both your presentations, Scott and Christine. People are really excited to hear from you and to learn what you had to say in the questions as well. So I will hand back over to Lisa, who will talk a little bit about what's happening next time.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you everyone for your participation in discussion this evening. It's always a vibrant discussion and lots of questions, and we really appreciate everyone sending in those questions and allowing us to really explore these issues. On behalf of us all, I'd like to extend sincere thanks to both Christine Yeats and Scott McKinnon for joining us for our June History Matters and for sharing their knowledge and experience. So we can't do a big round of applause to you, but on behalf of everyone, thank you.
Thank you.
I would also like to just plug both of their websites again. So if you feel fired up to become a volunteer in one of these groups, pridehistory.org.au and of course rahs.org.au for the Royal Australian Historical Society. We have another great lineup for you in July, and the topic is actually rescheduled from our cancelled April meeting for what we have, of course, did refer to as the COVID moment, I suppose, we're all living through. So we are going to go back to our topic from April, which is Writing a Life, Reflections on Biography. And our two presenters this month will be discussing the strengths and challenges for the biographer in trying to write a biography, which is one of our most enduring and popular forms of life writing. Our two speakers are Helen Ennis, who is the author of Olive Cotton, A Life in Photography, that was published by HarperCollins in 2019, and Margot Beasley, who is a professional historian currently working on a biography of Eric Dark. So I do hope you can join us in July. That'll be actually Wednesday, the 1st of July. And of course, the State Library will be hosting us once again. I'd like to say thank you formally to the State Library for being our host on behalf of the Professional Historians Association and Oral History New South Wales. It's a really great way for us to share knowledge and to discuss things that are relevant to scholarship and our profession. And of course, the State Library is a big supporter of historians and scholarship, and there's always lots going on. So I do have 2 other events to let you know about. And they're coming up this week. Tomorrow, on Thursday, the 4th of June at 7 o'clock, Gamilaroi Man and Library Curator Ronald Briggs will be talking about the extraordinary photographs of protests that were published in the Tribune newspaper. So that will be certainly worthwhile catching. And then on Friday, the 5th of June, this is a lunchtime one at 1 p.m, Senior Curator Elise Edmonds will be sharing some of the amazing stories from the Devonshire Street cemeteries, the cemeteries that dominated the landscape where Central Station now stands. And of course, being a Taffaphile myself, I will be coming along to that one. So I hope you are able to join us for one of those events. Have a very good evening. And of course, I hope to see you next month at History Matters. Thank you.